I'd like to welcome everybody to the Provost Faculty Colloquium series. Today we are going to hear from Dr. Galit Gertsenzon. She has her BA and MA from the University of Tel Aviv and her PhD from the Cincinnati Conservatory. She has performed all around the world, notably at Carnegie Hall. And today she is going to do her presentation on Forbidden Sounds, the music of Gideon Klein.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I will be speaking about the music of Gideon Klein, a young composer who was murdered in a few years after being imprisoned in Theresienstadt concentration camp. And I will start by telling you a little bit how I got acquainted with music of the Holocaust and particularly with the music of Gideon Klein. This has been in 2001 while I was a master's student in Tel Aviv University. A friend of mine decided to audition for a history, music and memory workshop in Israel. She was a soprano and she asked me to accompany her. And I, of course, said yes. And my piano teacher at the time thought it would be a good idea for me to take a look at this sonata by an unknown composer named Gideon Klein, who was murdered in the Holocaust. And he mentioned this is a really difficult piece, so you might just play one movement. And shortly after I decided that I should explore this piece, I auditioned and I also participated in this workshop that I think is still running in Emek Hefer, which is close to the north part of Israel, in Kibbutz Givat Chaim Ichud. And so at the time, in 2001, the people who were in charge of, and they probably also could be regarded as the pioneers of collecting all this music by composers and musicians who perished during the Holocaust. These were the late Professor David Bloch, and Professor Alan Sternfield, who is I'm supposing he still teaches at the Jerusalem Music Academy, the late Professor Dudu Sela, and Mrs. Anita Tarsi and Yonat Klar. These were the people that I was in charge with. And the amount of and the wealth of music that I discovered at this workshop led to a lot of collaborations later and performances of music, not just by Gideon Klein, but many other composers. And so because I don't have too much time today, I will just be talking a little bit about the music that I've played by Gideon Klein and some of the music I researched. What you see here is a picture of Theresienstadt, Theresienstadt concentration camp. So if I say Theresienstadt or Theresienstadt, it's the same thing. What you can see is that this was a garrison town that was built by the emperor in 1780, 1790. This town that was built as a, I'm assuming it was a vacation place for him, was later transferred to become a prison for First World War prisoners. And during the Second World War, it became a prison for political prisoners and mostly for Jews, according to my reading. And the numbers, depending on what historical sources we're looking at, about 150,000 Jews were sent there. At the end of the war, there were about 150 children who survived, and I guess the amount of people who survived the Holocaust in general was about 250,000. So I'm assuming there were very little survivor in Theresienstadt after the war. But what's interesting about Theresienstadt was the fact that there were a lot of the elite people from the Jewish religion who gathered into this camp. There were a lot of painters, numerous amount of composers, actors, from every, just individuals from every art, including philosophers and university professors, and even a very famous film director, Kurt Geron, which later which I think was also the reason he was sent there, was to make Theresienstadt a sort of a propaganda place to be filmed in a movie and later shown to the rest of the world, that the Jewish people were treated very well there. And just a basic search on YouTube, you can see a lot of original scenes from that movie that was made. And this painting that we are seeing here is a painting that was made in Theresienstadt. And this is another painting by a child who later survived. She brought with her ink and all kinds of crayons, and she pretty much just painted her life there and the life of other people. And her name was Helga Weissova-Hoskova, and she survived, and she became a very prominent artist after the war. And when we look at the life of Gideon Klein, we pretty much see for classical musicians, he was doing the right thing. He received musical education from a young age. He was very good at piano, and so he was sent. He lived in a town called Brno, which was quite far from Prague. And a few years into his piano studies, he was sent to study in Prague. First, he would take the train from his hometown to Prague, and later, I think it was toward the age of 20, he moved to Prague on his own. I think one of his sisters came with him, and he started composing at the age of 15. His style, we can say that he was very much influenced by avant-garde composers such as Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg. There is also a lot of folk aspects in his music that are probably an influence from Czech Moravian composers. And what's interesting to see about his life, that around shortly probably after he came to Prague, these dates are symbolizing the fall of his life. So in 1939, when the Nazis closed all the Czech universities after occupying Prague, all the Jewish people were forced to leave, and so they were not allowed to study in the universities, and I'm assuming also a lot of them were not allowed to work anymore. And Klein was forced to leave the studies at the university, but he was also studying at the conservatory. And I think at the beginning he still maintained some education at the conservatory with his teacher. And I guess the fall of 1940 is primarily important for the songs that I will be listening with you today, because at that point, I guess there was a very short window for Jews to leave countries in Europe, go into United Kingdom, or those who were able to move to United States. There was a short window where they could move, and that window closed. And at that point, even though Klein was accepted into the Royal Academy in London, he was not able to leave. And then in December 1st, 1941, he was deported into Theresienstadt, and he was there for about 3 years. And in fall 1945, this is the time he was murdered. We don't really know how he was murdered. What I read from several sources was that he was sent on one of the transports from Theresienstadt into Auschwitz, and somehow he ended up his life in Fürstengrube camp. There are rumors that there was a piano in that camp, that there was an SS commander that asked him to play something, and he played, but he probably did not play something that was tonal and not something that was pleasant to that SS commander. And the rumor is that this is how he ended his life, but we really don't know, and we probably will never know. And what's also interesting, not only for Klein, but for many other artists and especially composers in Theresienstadt, is that this was the most fruitful time in his compositional career. So if you take a look at this list of compositions that I took from Buzzi and Hoch's website, a lot of these compositions were written in Theresienstadt. So while he was imprisoned, he had an access to a little bit to paper and ways to write, and he really used his talents to not only compose music for, and I'm hoping that I will tell you exactly why for those specific instruments, but he was composing, he was teaching orphan children in the camp, he was arranging a lot of music for choirs, he was acting as a rehearsal pianist for a lot of productions of opera. And one of the interesting things is, you would think that people who are imprisoned, how would they have the ability to create music or to listen to music? But this was something very special about this camp, because this was allowed. And so when I finally got into the stage of my dissertation at CCM, that was after many years of playing this music. But my view of this was a view of someone who plays, not a theorist, not a composer. So I was interested in trying to find the meaning in his compositions, his various compositions. Some of these compositions that are very atonal, to me they sounded very uncertain, tragic, very sad. But then if I was to talk to a composer or a theorist, they would tell me, well, this is the style, and you cannot assume that this is sad just because. So I was, as I said, trying to find the meaning in those pieces, but specifically, I wanted to see what is it in the music that I can prove that Klein was writing out of fear and uncertainty, or was he resisting his situation? Was he struggling? We would think that this is, of course, if someone is in a position where he's kicked out of the university, not able to work, not able to perform, would do that. But actually, a lot of music that was written in the camps was happy and hopeful. So this was my very specific question in my dissertation. And so what I would like to do is play you some maybe excerpts from the songs and a little bit of the sonata, and see what would you think about this. So the piano sonata is written very, very clearly. Its formal procedures are those of a sonata form, and it's very easy to follow the process of the themes and how they correspond to each other. It has 3 movements, but there was another source that I found that was saying that while being in Theresienstadt, Klein started writing a 4th movement, and he sketched a few measures and nothing. Later he was sent east to Auschwitz, and so there is no 4th movement, there are only 3 movements. And just like a classical sonata form, the first movement is fast, the second movement is slow, and the third movement is a fast ABA. I will go ahead and play for you the 3rd movement. few things to look to when we listen to this piece. And especially these are the things that struck me when I just learned the piece was this. And it's very aggressive, and it's even physically very hard to do. And this was one of my questions. What is this meaning? What is it trying to say? Of course, there's no evidence. We cannot really say anything that he did not say. So it's up to the performer or anyone who wants to analyze this to try and find what is this message that Klein is trying to tell us. So what is it a musical composition trying to tell us? Now, every musical composition has a meaning, of course, I'm hoping. And a lot of musical compositions have a story behind them, but given the circumstances of a person who has a very, very troubled life, writing music that's so harsh, so dissonant, these were my questions. How is it uncertain? Would he write in different ways? Had he not been imprisoned? We really do not have the answer for this, but we can, at least this is where we can use our interpretational skills to show our opinion and our findings. So what I found interesting about the songs Opus 1 was the fact that they were written in 1940, and that was around the time when Klein was let go from his studies, and he was also not allowed to perform publicly for concerts. So he spent his time writing music, and he also changed his name to Karl Vranek, and he performed secretly in apartments and had audience that came and heard him. And this is also about the time that he composed those 3 songs. And the interesting thing is that the songs and several other pieces were believed to be lost until the early 90s, when a suitcase that he had handed to a friend of his was found in an attic of that friend's house. And this is how we found, well, not me, but this is how a lot of his pre-Holocaust music was found, and we are able now to see how his music sounded before concentration camp and during the concentration camp. So this is the first song, translated to English as The Fountain. So it starts pretty happy, I would say, positive. And I have to also mention that this recording is by Wolfgang Holzmeier and Russell Ryan, and it's the best recording that I've been working with ever since looking at these songs more closely. So one of the questions I had was, okay, how can I prove that these are songs that a person who is perhaps suffering, who's facing uncertainty writes? I was looking a lot into the texts of these songs, and I found that somehow he chose these particular songs that are very uncertain, that they have kind of dual messages, such as a stanza that starts very nicely, very pleasantly, but then there is all this running springs, murmur and whisper and fear of the snowy time. And I'm assuming he was not able to really just say in words what he was going through, so perhaps he was choosing those texts to express what was going on in his life at the time. And so when we look at the second song, this one by a poet that I also found was, his texts were composed to a lot of settings in Theresienstadt by several composers. And this song was completed in also May 6, 1940. All the three of them were completed around the same month. And Hölderlin himself was suffering from mental illness, and he died at a very young age. And it was interesting to me that once again Klein takes a text, which the text was in German, and a good friend of Klein, who was Saudek, translated it for German. And what we heard in this recording was, of course, a Czech. But I also got some really good people who translated this to English. So we can look at the English and see that, once again, the first stanza is very happy, a second stanza that shows a lot of cold and silence and loneliness. But then I got into the third song, and this time Klein chose a text by Goethe. And this is the most extensive song of the three. And once again, if we are looking at on the right, at the English translation, we can see that, you know, we can see this text in positive ways too. And I also found that Brahms composed a musical setting for this text, so we can compare a little bit, although the theorists in this room might not agree with me. So let's listen a little bit to this song, and after this I will play a little bit from the Brahms setting, and we'll see. This too by Russell Ryan and Wolfgang Holzmeier. So for the sake of time, I will play you a few lines from the Brahms setting for the same text. So what I heard when comparing these two songs together was that Brahms was using some tonal transition between minor to major, and you know, if we really listen to the song and get into the music, we can have some sense of catharsis at the end, and seeing the positiveness about that time of dusk and the intimacy that Brahms shows in this setting. But I did not find this in Klein's setting. It was rather not only uncertain, not only sad and lonely, but there was just something hopeless in the way that Klein sets this text to music. And so, according to the way I saw this, according to the way I saw those songs composed in 1940, I thought that these songs are showing that Klein was probably knowing what was going on with his fate and with his future, and he was expressing this in his music. And this is just in a nutshell from a wealth of music that was composed around the time in Theresienstadt. There was also music composed in other concentration camps, but really Theresienstadt is the one place that has such a wealth of information that these 35 minutes were just a tiny little bit of all this music that exists from this very tragic time. So a lot of information and very good quality articles are in this website, Oral Foundation, which I'm constantly using, and a more basic resource that has also a lot of information on all the entire wealth of music associated with the Holocaust is in holocaustmusic.org. The two very important books that I'm still reading throughout these years are Gideon Klein's biography by Milan Slavitsky, which one of my students told me she could not even get access to at this point, and also Yoza Karas's book Music into Resin, which is relatively old, from 1985, but has a very basic information about what was going on in Terezin and who were the major composers that were working there at the time. Thank you.